Shakir.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. Good evening or good morning to all of you, depending on the time zone in which you live. We are pleased to have people in this meeting from different time zones all over the world. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 15 years, and this is the 163rd edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 162 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. And in the past 3 years, 4 months, and 3 weeks, we have featured 705 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 162 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking for your suggestions and volunteers, as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details. We would like to join the national and international community in mourning the loss of the Grand Master of Indentureship Studies, Professor Brinsley Samaru of Trinidad and Tobago. In his memory, we will be doing a special Zoom program on Sunday, September 17th, 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator this evening or tonight is again Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of this Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalama, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shakira. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I want to say thank you so much for choosing to be here with us. This public meeting will take the usual form of a panel discussion and followed by Q&A. We are recording live, and this would be uploaded later permanently on YouTube. This meeting is also being live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. So we want to welcome all our viewers on YouTube. To avoid intrusions from trolls, our IT manager has muted everyone. Speakers, please do not admit anyone, do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thank you so much for cooperating. Over the next 2 hours, we will be discussing the topic, Invisible Indians with Nelson Mandela in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. During the decades of struggle against apartheid in South Africa, which was from the 1940s to around the 1990s, Asian Indians or Indo-South Africans made significant contributions to and stood alongside Nelson Mandela and the broader anti-apartheid movement. Building upon Mahatma Gandhi's principles of passive resistance, their involvement was pivotal in the fight for equality and justice, but not well known and not much discussed. Inspired by Gandhi's teachings, prominent individuals such as Ahmed Kathrada, Ismail and Fatima Mir, Billy Nair, Monty Naikar, Freen Ginwala, Yusuf Dadu, Molvi Chachalia, and scores of other known and unknown freedom fighters emerged. We're going to hear about them today from our esteemed panel of speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, for legal purposes and to avoid lawsuits of slander and defamation, we hereby state that the views expressed by presenters and participants are their own and do not necessarily represent those of the ICC. Let us bring on our first speaker. And this is none other than Dr. Ila Gandhi, granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. She was confined for 5 years under house arrest during apartheid. She's a former member of parliament in South Africa representing the African National Congress. Welcome, ma'am. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much, and greetings to all of you present here tonight or this morning. In this short space of time, I have decided to focus on 3 issues of importance to the subject of this webinar. I'm not going to focus on just one individual, but on 3 issues, which are, I can't see my presentation if the screen is taken over. Can you Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I want to talk about our struggle, the role Indians played in the struggle, and the concept of invisibility. So those are the three issues that I've chosen to talk about. There were many confrontations with the system from the early days of South African history, but I have taken 8 key milestones that I believe were very important in the history of our struggle. The first one is the Xhosa and the Zulu wars against the colonial powers, which ranged from 1877 right up to 1906. These were wars. Then came the Natal Indian Congress in 1894 and the various satyagraha campaigns culminating in a mass demonstration in 1913. The third one is the 1946 NIC. In 1946, NIC embarked on passive resistance campaigns against oppressive laws. Then in 1947, the NIC, the Transvaal Indian Congress, and the ANC formed the Three Doctors Pact, that is between Monty Naika representing the NIC, Yusuf Dadu representing the Transvaal Indian Congress, and A.B. Nguma representing the ANC. And this was forging a non-white united front. In 1949, riots between Indians and Africans were orchestrated by the government of the time to break up this unity that took place. But the riots were rapidly curbed by Chief Albert Luthuli, the leader of the ANC at that time, and Monty Naika, the leader of NIC at the time, who visited various townships together to call for peace. There were others, of course, who were involved as well. The sixth point is that in 1950s, the Congress Alliance was formed, bringing together Indians, African, white, and colored communities together with the trade union movement, leading to the 1955 Congress of the People and drawing up of the Freedom Charter. Then in 1969, at the Morogoro Conference, the decision to open membership of the ANC to all race groups was taken. And then the eighth point is that later in 1983 again, the need for unity among the people, the oppressed people, was realized by the launch of the UDF and later the mass democratic movement. My second point is, who were some of the participants in the struggle of Indian origin? What we see from the history is the bringing together of the different races and ethnic groups into a united front over the years by the liberation movement. While the government from the early days tried to keep the groups apart, separate, through many strategies, including the offer of separate government to each ethnic group and the Group Areas Act, which still remains with us today. Not legal separation, but the physical separation that was orchestrated by the Group Areas Act. Within this political scene and over the years, many people of Indian origin participated in the various struggles of the people, ranging from civic struggles, social, cultural, religious, and political organizations, and struggles confronting unjust laws and forging unity. And then beyond this was the Indian participation in the armed wing of the ANC, and many played a supportive role to those who took political action against the government and its racist policies, such as, people who went into exile, people who were detained and house arrested, people who were banned, and so on. There were organizations that played a supportive role to all these people. While this was so, it must be mentioned that there were some who supported the apartheid government and actively joined the government forces in many ways, including special spies, the armed forces, and the police forces, special units, acting against the liberation forces actively. Now, as we are looking at those who were with Mandela and particularly worked with him, there are many. There were the hundreds of foot soldiers who worked going house to house, campaigning and participating in the various campaigns led by the ANC. Example, the boycotts, the marches, the rallies, and defiance campaigns. And those who participated in the M plan or the Mandela plan of forming decentralized cells and exercising special lines of communication so as to maintain security of the participants. Of course, many of these activities were infiltrated, and so many were imprisoned, executed, and banned, house arrested, and banished. We worked with all race groups since the 50s, but the few that played a prominent role were people such as already mentioned IC Mir, Fatima Mir, Jayan Singh and Ravi Singh, Dr. and Mrs. Monty Naika, Billy Nair and Elsie Nair, Ahmed Kadrada, Lalu Chiba, and many others who were much younger, and many others whose stories have not yet been told. But many stories also have been told, and people know about them. This then brings us to my last point, and that is the concept of invisibility and how we deal with it. Through our actions, we reduce people to become invisible. When we look at society generally, we see that those in menial jobs, domestic workers, farm workers, cleaners are all invisible workers. During the COVID outbreak 2-3 years ago, for the first time, the importance of these invisible workers was realized. Then we see women often being marginalized and become invisible. In the political movement in the early days, many women played the role of catering for the men who sat and strategized. As early as 1913, 1 year after the formation of the ANC, women organized and marched against the pass laws being extended to women and received attention and recognition for their organizational and political ability. Yet women were not part of the ANC. They were not allowed to be members of the ANC at that time in 1913. Much later, women were allowed to become full members. Women's struggle for recognition continues and can form the subject of a separate discussion. But what we learn from this is that invisibility has 3 significant layers. The first one, society through its norms and practices makes certain groups invisible. The second point is the invisible through the acceptance of these norms and practices make themselves invisible. And the third point is that our own reluctance to want recognition, as many of us join the struggle because we consider it a duty, our dharma, to confront injustices. We do not participate because we want recognition or accolades. It is our dharma that we renounce the fruits of our actions. So it is again our own convictions and beliefs that keep us away from limelight and we remain invisible, so to speak, even though we are assertive in claiming our rights and fighting for justice. So invisibility has many reasons, and it is important to look at all these reasons and more reasons as well in order to address the issue of invisibility. So my final point is that yes, there are lots of people that haven't been spoken about. There are many foot soldiers that we don't even know about. And many of them are in that position where people don't know about them because of these three factors that I have outlined. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I would hear from others about the individual contributions of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ela Gandhi. That was a very enlightening introductory presentation. And I think you've set the stage for all of our other presenters. I want to thank you very much, and I hope that you stay with us until the end of the program so that you can take some questions. We appreciate your being here and all that you've shared with us. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to our second speaker, and this is Mr. Nishan Baltan. He's the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation since its inception in 2008. He's a community and political activist and has been so for over 40 years with involvement in the underground ANC activism. Welcome, Mr. Baltan. You can go ahead and speak.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my time with Mohammed Kesabji, so I've only got about 8 minutes. So don't worry too much about the slides. I'll move through them very quickly.
Okay.
So there's a couple of things. Firstly, just the way in which the topic has been framed, which I thought was particularly provocative, intentionally or not, I'm not too sure. But what I really have grappled with is why the singular focus on Mandela, when I think Indian participants in the liberation struggle would have worked with many African leaders and also beyond the ANC. But I think the subtext of the way in which it has been framed talks about unwavering dedication. I'm not sure that we've had unwavering dedication of the vast majority of Indian people to have been participants in this liberation struggle. I think there were periods of heightened participation, but also periods of complete acquiescence. The provocation talks about the collective efforts of all Indians. Now, if there's anything that I think is misleading, it's that framing. You've never had the collective efforts of all Indians in the anti-apartheid struggle. I think these were smaller numbers of people, significant numbers who chose not to participate, but also huge numbers who preferred to collaborate with the establishment. So there can't be any notion of collective efforts of Indians to the liberation struggle. I think there would be collective efforts or efforts of those aligned to the liberation movement and related organizations. So the entire framing of this, I think, is something that would have to be re-looked at if this kind of discussion were to take place at a later point. The framing talks about Indians being overlooked and marginalized in history and overshadowed by other narratives. Now, I'm not sure if you are aware of how this plays into contemporary South Africa, where there's this huge discussion amongst Indian people as being the victims of democracy and everything, and feeling that they have not been the beneficiaries of democracy, perhaps, that they think they should have. And this kind of framing more or less flows into that. I would really like from yourselves to understand which are these other narratives that would overshadow the contribution of Indians. Indians are less than 3% in this country. And from where I sit, I'm not sure in what ways they've been overshadowed, which links to this issue of unrepresentation. Their stories and sacrifices have been underrepresented. I'm not sure that that is actually true. If I look at the last 10 to 15 years, the numbers of publications and books that have come out on Indians who have been part of the liberation struggle perhaps exceeds that even of African people. And if there's been any underrepresentation, I think it's the stories of thousands of African participants in the liberation struggle who have not been equally profiled. This provocation then talks about the primarily focus on the Black majority population. I don't know what would be wrong about that. Black African people are the majority in this country. Their stories have not yet been told, to the point where I think even the numbers of participants who are known, African participation in the liberation struggle by all South Africans is at the minimum. So if there's anybody who's really been overshadowed, rightly or wrongly, by the kind of Mandela narrative, it would be African people. The knowledge of people like Walter Sisulu and others of that generation is not as high as they should be amongst all South Africans. So I think the issue of invisibility is questionable. Personally, I think it is actually false. So what I am critiquing is that this issue of Indians having played a major role in the fight against apartheid consistently, I think that again would be questionable. The truth is that Indians were by and large divided on how to relate to the African majority since the time of arrival in 1860. Many chose to be collaborators, many chose to work with the liberation movements, but Indians have, as Mohammed Mamdani says, they're neither settlers nor natives, and would vary between the kind of consciousness around both of them. And as I've raised here, the single focus on Mandela, I think is slightly misleading. For Kathrada in particular, and many of his generations, is really Nehru to whom they would have referred to. And Nehru in particular, his call to Indians to align themselves with the African majority is what they would have followed. Kathy himself would have fought many evils, as he said, in his own lifetime. Born in 1929, the Great Depression, formative years in the Second World War, member of the Young Communist League, shaped by that kind of ideology, shaped by Dr. Dadu and others, who turned the Indian Congresses into a more progressive organizations and gradually work for unity with African people. There's limited time, but Kathy's lifespan, there's before prison, there's after prison. This particular slide, I think, summarizes his life up to prison itself. Goes in at 34, comes out at 60. In total, spends 9,500 days plus in prison. And you can see his changing face in this. Again, just quick background. This is the slogan that brings the National Party into office, and this is what he rejects and entire movements fight against. Apartheid affects African people. Also, specifically, it targets Indians to want to get them out of the country. And until 1960, Indians can't stay, or their efforts to move them out. As I think Eli has covered this, but one of the big significant things is Kathy's attendance the World Federation of Democratic Youth, his visit to Auschwitz, is a major turning point in his understanding of the evils of racism and why it needs to be opposed, and becomes a lifelong quest for him up until his death. Comes back, I think we've spoken about the Defiance Campaign, joint work between the Indian and Congress and the African National Congress. But 54, he gets banned. 56, he's on treason trial. Throughout his life, there's about 17 times that he's arrested. In total, he's really a major participant in the major trials of the 20th century. 62, he goes under house arrest. I mean, he's placed under house arrest. He breaks that. He goes underground. He's caught at Rivonia. Now, this is where you see Kathrada, and particularly to read the transcripts of his trial at Rivonia, is what would give you insights into his life. In this trial, they found guilty. Kathy has the option to appeal. Is the one that there's the least amount of evidence against. But significantly, he chooses not to do this. And in his mind, if I can just read very quickly to you his reasoning for this.
Okay, Mr. Balton.
No, just give me 1 second.
Okay, time.
So non-racialism is a big part of his life. And this is a defining feature. This is some of the work that he has tasked us to do, which is why I say that Indians are not isolated or not invisible. Lastly, is this particular slide, which is not related directly to your topic, but I think underpins it. And if you look at really where Indians are today economically, it does make you question the whole issue of invisibility and sidelining, both socially as well as politically. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Balton, I want to thank you very much for, number one, critiquing the way the topic has been structured. And what you've identified really couches it for us, because you must understand that for those of us who live outside of South Africa and who did not experience apartheid or have any relatives who experienced apartheid, we did not know what you know. And therefore, I want to thank you very much for raising the points that you have. And I hope the other speakers can continue to enlighten us about this topic. So I want to welcome at this point in time, Dr. Mohammed Keshavi. He's a South African-born, British-trained barrister now living in the UK. He's a well-known author and commentator on the Indian diaspora in Africa. And he will also speak, but this time from his personal knowledge of Ahmed Kathrada. Welcome, sir. You can go ahead. Shakira will play your PowerPoint.
Thank you, Shalima. Have you got the PowerPoint ready for me, please?
Yes, Shakira is bringing it up for you. You can go ahead and start if you like.
Thank you very much, Nishan. I really value the valuable contribution you've made and the issues you've brought up. But as Shalima says, I think we need a bigger seminar to really pull out some of these very critical issues that you are mentioning about invisibility and representation. Basically, I will be very brief. I want to firstly thank Nishan for giving a broad picture of Ahmed Kathrada's life. And I would like to make a few points purely as a Pan-African Indian diasporic appreciation, because I'm a South African who lived in Uganda, who lived in Kenya at the time of the Uganda expulsion. And so I was able to see the Indian contribution towards the African struggle in a slightly different perspective by being an outsider in an area like East Africa. So firstly, I'd like to make the point that I made when I wrote a part obituary of Ahmed Kathrada's life, that Kathrada was part of a larger struggle in Africa, starting with the arrival of the indentured laborers in November 1860, with the SS Truro and the SS Belvedere. Though Ahmed Kathrada was not part of the indentured laborers as such, and this I would mention in the next slide that comes up, in the evolution of the Indian demography in South Africa. Ahmed Kathrada came in the second wave of Indians who came to South Africa in the 1870s. They were known as passenger Indians. They were not part of the Girmitias, but they came in about 10 years after the indentured laborers. So there was a sort of a bifurcation in the South African demography from the 1860s and 1870s as the demographic profile of the Indians sort of changed in South Africa. I'd just like to mention that in 1860, with the two ships, the SS Truro and the SS Belvedere, you found the bulk of the Indians coming to South Africa to settle there. To work in the sugar plantations. It's in the 1870s that you see the second wave of people coming in as petty traders on the back of the indentures. And then we see the developments in Natal in the 1890s, leading to the Natal Indian Congress that was started by Mahatma Gandhi, and then the developments in Transvaal since 1885. These are different provinces in South Africa where the racial discrimination legislation was taking different shapes from the 1860s right up to the 1890s. Can we get to the next slide, please? I think an important aspect to keep in mind is the arrival of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Mahatma Ji, in 1893. On June the 7th, he was thrown out of a train at Pietermaritzburg in Natal. And the rest of his story, as Dr. Ella Gandhi did mention, he establishes the Natal Indian Congress in 1895, develops the concept of Satyagraha, and writes the blueprint for India's independence called the Hind Swaraj. Now, these are interesting milestones in not only the consciousness that was created for India's independence, but also many developments that were taking place in many other areas where indentured laborers had settled. I'd like the next slide, please, that Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy inspired, among others, Thambi Naidu, who was from the South Indian background, Yusuf Dadu, that Nishan Bolton mentioned, Monty Naikar, Ismail Mir, Nelson Mandela. But also, I make the point that it wasn't Nelson Mandela alone. There were important African leaders, Clement, I can't remember the name, but in the 1940s, there were a host of African leaders right from the beginning in 1912, right up till the 1940s. But Mahatma Gandhi's influence extended to elsewhere in Africa. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika, and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and Martin Luther King in the United States were inspired by this whole movement for freedom that Mahatma Gandhi inspired and others followed. If we go to the next slide, please, I would just speak of few milestones in Ahmed Kathrada's life that were very critical. That he started as a political activist at the age of 12. He contributed as a student attending the World Youth Festivals in Eastern Europe. I believe he went to Berlin, to Budapest, and also to Warsaw. This is a very critical part of the development of political consciousness, which started very much in Eastern Europe at the time. And Ahmed Kathrada was there at the Berlin Youth Festival in 1951. He was one of the 156 accused in the 4-year treason trial in 1956, went underground in 1962. The next slide. The key elements of his commitment that have touched me very deeply are that he was arrested on the 11th of July, 1963. He was the youngest in the group of 9 people. And as Nishan mentioned, the prosecution case was weakest against him. He could have jumped off the boat and said, right, you guys go to prison, I'm clear. That is not what he did. He went with the whole group and spent over 9,000 days in prison. Immediately on arrival, he protested against unfair racist treatment of Black prisoners. His post-release contribution was to social justice and the preservation of history. And he never hankered over positions. Can we take the last slide? And that is where I wanted to touch on Kathrada, the man, as I got to know him in perhaps the last 10 years of his life. There was his book launch in Toronto many years ago. I think it was around 2000, if I'm not mistaken. And in Letters from Robben Island, a brilliant book of his, which I would recommend we all get hold of, he was talking about in one letter how a bird got into his cell, and he had not had any other contact with human life for almost 10 years or so, or less. And suddenly this bird perched on his arm, and he was so tempted to keep the bird in his cell. But then he says, how am I fighting for my freedom? What moral right do I have to prison another soul? Which was so deep. It was so deep about the man's humanism, the man's commitment to freedom, not for human beings, not for just one race or another, but for all sentient beings, which he included animals as well. In New York, when somebody said, you're very special, you are not hankering after position, he said, I joined the struggle not for a position. And he said, I'm not special. He said, neither is Mr. Mandela special. I think the greatest thing about Kathrada was that he didn't believe that he had an entitlement to anything for what he did and what he stood for. He said, we would do it again if we had to. The third story is that there was this girl called Michelle Brits, who came from a community of Afrikaner racists, and she was dying of leukemia. She came to Robben Island, she only had a few weeks to live, and all she wanted was, she wanted to touch the hand of Nelson Mandela. She wanted to meet him. And it was Ahmed Kathrada and his partner, Barbara Vaughan, who actually got in touch with Mandela and made sure that President Mandela would go right to her bedside where she was dying and take a whole lot of toys to her. And really, there is the story that Mandela hugging this little kid who's dying and tears going down both their eyes. Again, it showed the depth of the man, that he had no bitterness. He was ready to forgive, like that entire cohort that he was part of. His pilgrimage to Mecca, what it did to him, that Ahmed Kathrada did not belong to one denomination. He believed in spirituality. He believed in the human race. He believed in everything beyond what faith stood for. But he was a committed Muslim in his belief. The BBC called his funeral nothing lavish or grand. But I think the most telling thing that I can remember Ahmed Kathrada for was at his funeral, he decided to speak truth to power. He decided, or his family decided, who would come to his funeral. And there was no fear when he stood for the concept of freedom. He was prepared to speak for what he believed, regardless of who was in power at the time. I think that a very important aspect, I think, that Kathrada's life gives to the diasporic Indians throughout the world on the fissure of the fault line of history is the fact when many people say that you Indians have always stood on the periphery, you've never participated. I agree with Nishan, not everybody has participated fully in the freedom struggle, but it's individuals from within the Indian diaspora that have given far, far greatly than we have really come to realize. And I think that in any discourse, Kathrada stands for the principle that there were Indians in Africa who gave completely of themselves in the freedom struggle. He was an icon, is an emblem for that particular metaphor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keshavji. I wish I had known this man. From what you've said, we need people like that today to look up to. I really wish we had known him. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's here now from our fourth speaker, and this is someone who's no stranger at all to us, Mr. Jane Nair. He will speak about his brother, Billy Nair, and Ibi Ibrahim, both anti-apartheid activists and long-serving political prisoners on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. Welcome, Jay. Go ahead, please. Jay, would you like to unmute?
Mute,
Right.
launch.
Want to share your screen?
Just 1 minute. Share screen. Yeah. That's it?
Okay. Good. Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you for having me. And what can I do after Sister Ella and the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation? I'm going to go on in sequence, and starting with this, my land acknowledgement as a second-generation indentured Indian from South Africa. I am on the lands of the Mississauga, which is part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Huron-Wendat and Wyandot nations. I recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. In light of the horrific discoveries made in the sites of formal residential schools and the complicated history of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, I remain more committed than ever to strengthen my relationship and ours with the Indigenous neighbors through action. I commit to read the Government of Canada's TRC report and the 94 calls to action. I am therefore privileged to be living in the city of Mississauga, which is home to many global Indigenous peoples. I thank them for allowing me to be part of this city in Canada. Having said that, I want to go straight into the point. This is the person that sort of set the stage for our family, and that is where Billy Nair comes into place, and my whole life with the struggle. And I'm not going to touch too much on Gandhiji because he sets the stage and we are the players on it, and just going right through to this point. The first passive resistors in Durban from the area in Clarewood was the women's batch in 1946. They were all Indian women, and in 1946 they were convicted and released in 1946 September, a matter of 2 weeks in prison. Now, having said that, we weren't invisible. We were visible from the day we got onto land, because our working and living conditions in the different areas were disgraceful, and they were taken advantage of. And this particular group is mostly the Tamil community from South India in the Clarewood area, which is the area that the South Indians settled. Then fast forward to Dr. Monty Naika, Uncle Monty Naika, and Dr. Yusuf Dadu on their return from India after attending the Freedom of India celebrations at the invitation of Mahatma Gandhi. Then goes to the next slide, which shows the Three Doctors Pact in 1947, where the three doctors joined hands. And although we heard that there were other leaders, and some of us didn't, touch on that, but some did, these three brought the struggle to a head. From the NIC in Natal, the Transvaal Indian Congress, and that's when Dr. Dadu became the South African Indian Congress president, and Dr. A.B. Zuma, the President General of the ANC. Next comes this person, the first Black African to win the Nobel Peace Prize while he was banned in South Africa. He was the chief of a Zulu tribe in Zululand, a school teacher, and I'll come to the point of being a school teacher, member of the ANC, president of the ANC, and he was banished in his last days to his homeland in Grouteville, just trying to cripple. Now, this is all after 1948, when the time the Afrikaner government took over the country and the apartheid was born. Now, why I touched on him being a school teacher, now my youngest brother and I were fairly bright kids in school, not to say much, and Bill used to showcase our skills and education. And one day I was in the NIC offices in Savile Street, and I came out from school, got to the office, and I showed Billy my report card. I was in standard 3 or standard 4. And I topped the class. And he told Chief Lutuli that I topped the class. And then Chief got me, sat me on his knee and said, Jaya, the only thing that nobody can take from you is education. And therefore, educate. Being a teacher and getting something from him, I was thankful. Next comes the group when Nelson Mandela comes into the picture. This was just before the Defiance campaign, and the two doctors, you got N.T. Naika, one of the secretary of the NIC, and Ismail Mir, the member of the executive, and Nelson Mandela, Dr. Dadu, and Dr. Monty Naika, ANC and SIIC executives. Then came the march down, I think this was Victoria Street in Durban, where you have Ismail Mir, Chief Lutuli, and these two were the women leaders of the African Women's League, the ANC Women's League, and Dr. Monty Naika, going down and everybody cheering them on. And I think this happened to be during the anti-pass demonstrations. Then came the big event in 1956. December 6, 1956, early in the morning, the special branch, the security service, and I know the two people, Sergeant Naidu and Sergeant Swanepoel, walked into our home, knocked at the door and just barged in and was looking for Bill's bedroom. We had a 2-bedroom house in Randalls Road, Sydenham, and that's where we were born. That's where we lived right up to 1960. And Billy was hounded from the time he got up to the time he went to the toilet, and he came back to his office, and they were just behind him, and they were at his cupboard and his units, and they removed books, all kinds of books that he was reading. These 156 were arrested on the same morning of December 6th. They were from all parts of South Africa. They were from different Congress movements, the ANC, the SAIC, South African Congress of Democrats, South African Communist Party, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions. Now, that was just started in 1955, where Billy was elected as the secretary of the Congress of Trade Unions, because Billy was concentrating more on the labor movement and more of unions, and then the South African Colored People's Organization. Then came Nelson Mandela. Now I'll come back to this slide and fast forward to Billy, why we celebrate him as a comrade, hero, legend, being visible in the South African Indian diaspora or South African Indian community. He was a member of the Natal Indian Youth Congress in 1949, member of the Natal Indian Congress, member of the South African Communist Party, defiance campaign in 1952, where he was arrested, and that parallels what I'm going to talk about, E.B. Ibrahim, that was working together and I in between. So the three of us sort of parallel life since 1952. In 1952, Billy was imprisoned. And when he came out, I remember clearly I had to scrub his body because of all the stuff that he must have collected in prison. And this was in the Durban Central Prison. He was a founding member of STAC2, Congress of the People, on 26 June 1955. Now, Billy had a habit of disappearing at different times for some short periods, some lengthy periods. And when he comes back, when we ask him, Bill, where did you go? Nothing said, because everything was done in secret. And later on in life, when I met him after he came out of Robben Island, he gave me the stories of all these events that took place. And now the Congress of the People, very famous part of the Freedom Charter that was adopted there. He was partly involved with the section that called for the, I'll give you the exact extract, where he talks about the people shall share in the country's wealth. And that is embedded in the Freedom Charter. And you could see he was for the people and not for himself. And in the treason trial, which lasted till 1960, all of them were freed. Then as the member of the ANC, at that point in time, in the 60s, 59, 60, they came to an understanding that they couldn't do a non-violent operation. They couldn't get the Afrikaner government to the table to talk inclusion and accepting the three different racial groups. So the task was violence, and that's when they stepped into that realm. And Mandela was working from the Transvaal, and Billy and a group of people in Natal. So they were known as Mkhonto Wesizwe. And I want to give one point here that which Bill told me, and he's not here to fault me on saying it. Since Chief Luthuli accepted the Peace Prize from Norway, he wasn't in favor of violent struggle, violent overthrow of the government. He was still a peacenik. So the rest of the group got their cudgels and started going into violent movements, and you know the rest, what happened. He was banned, imprisoned, treason charges, and eventually freed. He served a 20-year sentence on Robben Island from 1964 to 1984. Now, let me go back to, this is what is, and here is his cell in Robben Island and Mandela's cell number 5. Now, even after coming out of prison, he got involved with the UDF, and he was one of the 6 that were held in the British Embassy in Durban in 1986. George Supasad, another Indian, Archie Gumeda, an African, Billy Nair, Paul David, another Indian, Mewa Ramgobin, another Indian, and M.J. Naidu, all Indians. Now, they weren't giving up easily. although they went to Robben Island and came out, he still kept on the struggle. And he still looked for the negotiation table so that they can get. These are the awards that he was given or awarded. The Order of Lutuli in silver, the Moses Kotani Award, outstanding contribution to the SACP. That was while he was still in prison. The Gandhi Development Trust, the Satyagraha Award, 2007. Then the Indian government also awarded him the Pravasi Bharatiya Saman, the Minister of Overseas Indians, 2007. And then posthumously, he was given the Doctorate of Social Science for his advocacy of human rights and democracy by UKZN in 2009. This was after he passed away. Now let me go back. I'll give you some pictures of him receiving the award. Praveen Gordon, another Indian in the struggle. Vasu Govender, Maggie Govender, another stalwart. Elsie, that's Billy's wife. And this is his retirement in Tongat. That was his riding. That's Billy. That's Roy Padyachi, who took over from Billy. Mewa Ram Gobind, who was a member of parliament at that time. And I think this is Dr. Govender, and that was Billy's doctor. And this is Siva Naidu, who was very close to Billy. The next one. Just before I come to Ibai, I'd like to mention this individual who was also an Indian, but he was part of the Black People's Convention, and he was a ZAPO, a Zanian People's Organization, and he was a close ally of Steve Biko. He was incarcerated for 8 years on Robben Island, and he also was part of the struggle. Now, coming back to Ibrahim.
Jay, 15 minutes has passed. I know you have to speak about Mr. Ibrahim, so can we have that in about 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'll give you this.
Thank you.
Just the synopsis. In 1952, he tried to join the Defiance Campaign, but the leadership didn't want him because he was young. And I met Ibrahim in the Congress office in Savile Street in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. And Billy wanted me to work with him because he was in high school and I was entering high school. He was part of the then he became the Natal Indian Youth Congress member, and he became a secretary of Greville area when he moved in. Then he part of the Natal Indian Congress. Then he was a delegate, one of the 2 delegates, youngsters, going to the Congress of the People in Cape Town. He was active in raising funds for the treason trial, which I was also involved in, leafletting and going home to home and ask for donations. And I was doing it in my area, which is the Sydenham area, because Billy was from Sydenham. And we had the Sydenham branch of the Natal Indian Congress that did fundraising. Then he was a member at the Anti-Pass conference in Johannesburg, where Oliver Tambo, another individual that spoke at that Anti-Pass demonstration and conference. And then in 1960, Sharpeville occurred. And during that conference, they also launched the potato boycott. And I remember there was another boycott, a boycott of cigarettes that were manufactured by Rothmans of England. So we followed the boycott methodology that was taking place in India, and we also adopted that here. And all Indians were involved. Then he became part of the Mkhonto wa Sizwe, which is the violent part of the ANC. And He went to Robben Island prison, served 15 years, and when he came out, he became the deputy minister of foreign affairs. But before that, he was elected to the executive because, remember, they have a proportional representation of government. So he passed away also. Here's he with Billy and Sbu Ndebele, who was also in Robben Island, and Ibrahim. That's him. Now, that ends my presentation, and these are the names of some of the people that I put together, that I, worked with, lived with, and heard speak, and was very impressed in meetings and conferences and doing the agenda books and all that with EB for the different conferences. And my references I'm giving to Google, History Online, Dr. Betty Govindan, the Heritage Museum, Selvan Naidu, Gandhi Serve Foundation, and my memory, which I seem to be failing, but I'm trying my best. And this is my last. I would have spoken about Kathrada, but I didn't have much alliances with him or contact with him, but I know of him being part of the Congress Alliance and Congress movement, fighting for the freedom of South Africa, which South Africa enjoys today. And last but not least, thank you to the ICC for affording me this opportunity to give the workings of my brother, Billy Naya, and his contribution to the freedom struggle in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. And, by extension, thank you to your brother and to all those others that you've outlined there. There's so much that we still need to learn about Indians in the diaspora who would have contributed, because there's so little that we know about them. And I think it is very important that despite the fact that you feel that your memory is fading you need to share as much as you can that you do remember at this point in time, because without you all to share your personal interaction with these people, we have no other way of getting proper, correct information. So I want to say thank you very, very much for all that you shared with us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we move on now to our fifth speaker, and this is Professor Kalpana Hiralal. She's a historian at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She's the author of Sisters in the Struggle, Women of Indian Origin in South Africa's Liberation Struggle, 1900 to 1994. Welcome, Professor Hiralal. You can go ahead with your presentation. We're seeing this.
Sorry, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me, Shalima? Yes.
Yes,
okay.
We're hearing you now.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And good evening, everyone. And thank you to the ICC and Dr. Mahabir for giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel. Shalima, I'm just going to switch my video off because I think the reception would be better, and then I will continue with the present PowerPoint.
Sure.
So this evening, I would like to talk about my recently published book titled Sisters in the Struggle, Women of Indian Origin in South Africa's Liberation Struggle, 1900 to about 1994. And the women of Indian origin are, in many ways, invisible Indians in the struggle against apartheid, which was one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and something that the point that Ella Gandhi has alluded to. So this book actually took several years to complete, and my deepest gratitude, goes to the late veteran anti-apartheid campaigner and former head of the United Nations Center Against Apartheid, Dr. Enuga Reddy, who conceptualized this book, and I'm grateful for his meticulous assistance, unwavering advice, and support in compiling this book. And I would also like to thank my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Betty Govindan, for her unwavering support and her constructive critical comments on my work, and for allowing me to use one of her very apt poems for the book, titled I Am Woman, a poem on the South African Indian woman. So the key aim of this book is to address gaps in South African historiography, seeking to document the contributions of women of Indian origin in South Africa's road to democracy. It highlights their roles at different political periods in South African history, from the turn of the century till the end of apartheid. Through individual women's profiles, we get a better understanding of what factors informed and shaped their political consciousness, the complexities of their activism, and the challenges and constraints they endured as women, wives, mothers, breadwinners, activists, so on and so forth, and as well as the ways in which they kind of perceived their experiences. In addition, the involvement of South Africans of Indian origin during my own research is an underrepresented and under-researched aspect of the larger history of South Africa, and in particular, and rarer still, is the involvement and participations of women of Indian origin. So why South African women? What makes South African women of Indian origin worthy of a separate and a distinct study? So my choice for documenting women of Indian origin in the study was motivated by several factors, and given the time constraints, I will just highlight the most important. While in the book it's quite detailed. So first, as a young girl living in one of apartheid's designated Indian areas, attending an Indian school, an Indian university, and being part of and witnessing the student activism of the 1980s, have shaped my identity and memories of this period. Also, Indian women were not a monolithic ethnic group, and this multiplicity of differences impacted how they engaged in the politics of resistance. So they embraced multiple identities and oppression during apartheid, and regarding race, class, gender, religion, ethnicity. And so by focusing on Indian women, I hope to offer a deeper understanding of the complexities and the varied meanings of being Indian at different historical junctures, and how this identity shaped their political ideology and activism. Second, I also wanted to highlight through the profiles that women of Indian origin perceived their participation in the broader liberation struggle in South Africa. And one of the underlying themes of this book is their contribution to non-racialism. They did not embrace an ethnic Indian, that is, identity, but a very inclusive, broad South African identity. So barriers of race, class, caste, religion, etc. dissipated and became insignificant as they fought alongside other racial groups. And only as a collective group did they perceive constructive changes to be possible. I mean, they fought alongside women of other racial groups and defined themselves collectively as the oppressed. So the political ideals they embraced and the parties they affiliated supported and nurtured non-racialism. And we see this coming out through the profiles, because the profiles highlight women's experiences within these various diverse political parties, and thereby shifts the post-apartheid liberation stories, which have been dominated by the journeys of the African National Congress, to other political organizations like the Non-European United Front, the National Liberation League, the Non-European Unity Movement, the Natal Indian Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement, Abdusa, so on and so forth, who collectively played a significant role in South Africa's road to democracy. And then this book also maps almost 100-year resistance, and it allows insights into identity shifts over generations and how these women challenged enforced identities, that is, Indian, African, white, and colored, of colonialism and apartheid. So being Indian and Indian woman was contested, it was deliberated and problematized at different historical periods and evolved. For example, identity politics prevailed in the first half of the 20th century with the formation of the Natal Indian Congress in 1894. However, this changed when progressive members within the NIC in the 1940s and 1950s supported a multiracial alliance to defeat apartheid. Moreover, in the 1970s, politically conscious Indian women embraced the Black consciousness movement, which stressed political solidarity and collective identity. They discarded the Indian tag and identified as Blacks and Africans. So very quickly then, in terms of the structure of the book, there are 3 volumes. It focuses on the period from 1900 to 1994. There are 61 profiles, and these and in each volume there's summaries which prefaces and contextualizes the social, economic, political conditions at different historical periods. So volume 1 consists of part 1, and on the period from 1900 to about 1930s. And part 1 focuses on the Satyagraha campaign between 1907 and 1913, and how women were at the forefront of the struggle at a time when politics was the domain of men, and women were part of the Satyagraha campaign in 1913. They were not afraid to resist and court imprisonment. It also eliminates well-known activists such as Kasturba Gandhi and Valya Mudli. The latter's activism highlights the role of Indian youth played in defying racism, oppression, and segregation in the early years of the 20th century. But lesser-known narratives of women are also has been documented. And here in particular, women like Jagrani Devi Bhavani Dayal, who successfully challenged Gandhi and was insistent on participating in the 1913 Satyagraha struggle, or that of Bai Fatima Sheikh Mehta and her mother Hanifa Bibi, who regarded as among the first Muslim women to participate in the Satyagraha campaign, or that of Mrs. D. Lazarus and her sister Miss Thomas, who worked behind the scenes and who tended to the needs and comforts of the Satyagrahis in the Natal Midlands. And this is significant because it highlights that we need to look at the construction of activism beyond the public sphere, in other words, even to non-traditional spaces. And in volume 1, we also get part 2, where the focus is on the 1940s, in particular, the pacifist campaign of 1946-48. And once again, women were at the forefront of the struggle, signing up as volunteers, as resistors, leafleting, attending meetings, going door to door, mobilizing support, fundraising initiatives, so on and so forth. And this, their narratives brings out the activism of women that many both international and even South African audiences are not aware of. The lost narratives of women such as, Jamila Baba, an activist in the 1940s from the Transvaal, Mrs. Ella Naika, who served 2 terms of imprisonment, Mrs. Chela Pillay, a passive resistor from the Transvaal, Ms. Zora Mir, who addressed crowds and mobilized and went door-to-door campaigning and to mobilize support, urging the youth to participate. Mrs. Gauri Ramdev, who also joined the struggle. So these are the invisible women, whose histories we don't know, whose contributions we do not know. In the 1940s, women such as Dr. Gunam, Halima Ahmed Naqvi, Suryakara Patel were vocal in supporting non-racialism and were already forging contacts with women of other racial groups. For example, Dr. Gunam noted in the early 1940s, I quote, "It was already becoming apparent to us that we only succeed against oppressive race laws through a non-European united front." Close quote. So, and then we have volume 2 of the book, which focuses on the 1950s and 1960s. Here I highlight women's role in the Defiance Campaign, the anti-past protests, and this section highlights the shift in politics amongst the Indian community and the oppressed groups, the move towards non-racialism, and in the formation of a multi-racial organization like the Federation of South African Women, who laid the basis for collective resistance, and in particular, the anti-past protest of the 1950s. While the likes of, Ella Gandhi and Phyllis Naidu and Fatima Mir were well known, there were other women who were lesser known, who were often worked tirelessly behind the scenes and contributed to the struggle. Among them were Pumani Mudli, who worked tirelessly to improve the lot of the workers, excuse me, Rupi Bhagwanti, who supported her husband within the NIC, Maniben Sita, a passive resistor in the 1940s and became a lifelong activist, and Zuleika Christopher, a firm supporter of the African People's Democratic Union of South Africa, ABDUSA, and who was critical of, identity politics. And there are more women, unknown women, whose histories have yet to be documented. And then volume 3 focuses on the period, the 1970s and 1990s. And this is the Black consciousness movement, where it focuses on the significance of youth activism, the Black consciousness movement, and its impact on Indian women. And the profiles amongst them, like, for example, Julie Vedant, Sam Mudli, Asha Mudli, Pregs Govender, Harshila Narse, so on and so forth, reveal how women embraced the BCM and began to shed the Indian tag and identify as Blacks. They also challenged traditional notions of Indian female sexuality and were highly critical of ethnic organizations such as the Natal Indian Congress. Volume 3 also includes the narratives of families, the role of mothers, the role of wives, partners, and spouses who assisted the struggle in various ways. So the contributions of families, its inclusion in this volume, shows how family members who may not have been active in formal politics, yet contributed significantly to the liberation struggle. And this book seeks to show that the liberation struggle must not only be seen from the vantage point of formal politics. And so I would like to end with a quote from Sarojini Naidu in 1924, and I quote, "I want the day to come when in the history of a peaceful South Africa, the historian will show that the Indian women of South Africa, by their unselfishness and wisdom, were able to bring unity between the white man, the brown man, and the black man, and the colored man. Ask yourselves what you can do to make South Africa better. Think of your duties rather than your privileges," close quote. And I think this book, for me, succinctly encapsulates her call. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing the book to capture the contributions of all of these wonderful women who we would never have heard about. So thank you very, very much for the work that you've done. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on now to our 6th and final speaker, and this is Dr. Devi Mudli Rajab. She's the author of Women, South Africans of Indian Origin, 150 Years of Struggle from Indenture to Freedom. This was published in 2011. She will speak specifically about Fatima Mir, a prominent anti-apartheid activist. Welcome, Dr. Rajab. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. Are you going to start my slides? For the benefit of non-South African peoples, I thought I would quickly go through Fatima Mir's life, and then we could do a little analysis around it. But I would like to say, all right, are we beginning here? Thank you. I'd like to say that I knew her as a young girl, and I admired her, and she, and to a large extent, I felt I looked towards her as a mentor. And on my numerous visits to the home of Fatima Mir, I discovered a myriad of interesting facets to this personality. And each side added a coherence to the larger picture of a woman of great integrity, of humility, of kindness, and a philosophical depth. She had the capacity to embrace everyone around her, and yet she maintained her core beliefs as an anchor to her political might. Before she died, I visited her in her minimalist designed home in the heart of apartheid designed Indian area in Sydenham, surrounded by squatter camps, by pictures of her youth, her family, and her artworks. And there was something very Gandhian about her surroundings. It was uncluttered simplicity that evoked a richness in its message. She certainly was a woman that stood out and certainly did not allow herself to be invisible by any means. She was a moral stalwart of South African peace transition to democracy, and she will always be remembered and not be considered invisible even after her death. So I would like to quickly run through the life of this remarkable woman. Shall I move the slides as we go? Sorry. So to many of you who know her, she was a political leader, an academic, a writer, a human rights and gender activist, and a lifelong Gandhian. Fatima Mir's name certainly will resonate with the liberation struggle and the downtrodden. She ranked by our citizens as 45th of the 100 great South Africans in 2004. And she was one of our country's most distinguished 20th century leader and champion of the underclass. So she's published prolifically 40 books on a wide range of socio-political subjects and was acknowledged locally and internationally with a bounty of awards in recognition of her anti-apartheid work. And so her death in 2010 was certainly a nation's loss. Do I move this, or I'm not quite sure how it goes?
I'm sharing the slide, so if you can tell me next slide, that'll be great.
All right, would you move to
No,
the
Dr.
next?
Rajab,
Yeah.
Dr. Rajab, just indicate when you need it changed and Shakira will change it for you. Just say next slide, please.
Okay, right, thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Can I have the next slide? Here we see Fatima as an activist, the one picture you've just missed. But she was born in 1928 in Durban to a white mother, Rachel Farrell, and an Indian father, Musa Mir, who was born in Surat and hailed from a small Sunni Bora community. Her mother, Rachel, was an orphan of Jewish and Portuguese descent, and she converted to Islam and took the name Amina. Next slide, please. And here we see, and this picture tells a lot about Fatima's socialization. She was socialized in a family of two mothers who were very loving and very supporting. And she often talks about being born in a kutum, which is a community. And that actually influenced her political profile to a large extent. How she approached politics and activism was very much rooted in her early childhood and socialization in this community. Next slide, please. Yeah, so her activism started young, and that's interesting because She started in a school situation, collecting £1,000 for the victims of the Bengal famine caused by the British Raj in India. And in Standard 9, she formed a social club that started a school magazine as an editor. So we can see the metamorphosis of this whole political personality. When the passive resistance campaign was launched by the NIC, Fatima joined and was the beginning of a political career with the Passive Resistance Student Council, which she formed when she was 17 years old. I'll have the next one. We see this young Fatima, and we see what this, I find it very interesting that the gentleman behind her is so gobsmacked by this young girl that he's holding his hand to his mouth. So she must have been quite a firebrand, very young. The next one, please. During her days at the university, she studied social science and became a member of the Progressive Forum, which was part of the non-European unity movement. And in January 1949, during the Indo-African riots, Fatima played a very active role in trying to forge better relationships between the two communities. And she did this throughout her life in a very natural way. Then she would do things like run literacy classes for Black male house servants. And then she played a leading role in the NIC as the first women executive and of course, she played a very, very dominant role in mobilizing against the Group Areas Act in 1950. I lived in the neighborhood with her, and she lived in Ritson Road, and I lived in Heswell Road, and it was a very multicultural neighborhood of Indians, of whites, of playwrights, of coloreds, and even a Black lawyer who rented in a colored woman's neighborhood. So this was the neighborhood that we actually grew up in. And even at that time, I remember Fatima doing social science research on looking at the interracial contact between the various households in that neighborhood, who interacted with whom and in what way. Were they sending food across the fences, and how did they help each other? So she was very, very vibrant, even as a young girl. Can we move on to the next one, please? Here we see this, and the mic tells a lot about how young she was starting to speak and mobilize people. Okay, can we move on? Thank you. She was instrumental in forming the Durban and District Women's League, and after the 1949 riots, to improve relations between Indians and Africans. And she was also very instrumental in marching to the union buildings and joining along up with women of all racial groups, where they chanted, "You strike a woman, you strike a rock." I'll have the next one. Thank you. Fatima wrote a lot, and I think her doctoral dissertation was on race and suicide in South Africa, but her books, the apprenticeship of a Mahatma was made into a film. So again, you can see this highly creative woman using every possible literary opportunity to get a message across. We'll move on, please. earlier I had, I had mentioned that she was the first woman who was accepted to the University of Natal to be a lecturer there. And when she was lecturing there, on one occasion, I remember I was lecturing at UDW, and she and Dr. Gunham were in the garden. What were they doing? I'm not quite sure. But so they asked me, and they confronted me for working at an ethnic institution. And Fatima said, you are working at an ethnic institution. And I said to her, well, Fatima, so are you, because you're teaching white students, I'm teaching Indian students. Anyway, I must say that she was very gracious about that and acknowledged, that fact, that in fact, none of us could escape what was out there for us from that point of view. She founded lots of institutions. She was amazing. Black research. At that time, South African writers Indian writers were almost non-existent. And Fatima realized that there was only one way in which she could open up that avenue. And that's when she started Madiba Publishers, because the white publishers at the time were certainly not giving us opportunities to express ourselves. And so Fatima made a very, very grand opportunity there for writers. Then she started the Pambili School, which was the Hindu Tamil Institute. And I remember going to that institute to learn the language. But when the Hindu Tamil Institute came to an end and Fatima bought that school and made it into the Pambili School for Black youth. Then there was the Tembelisa Tutorial College, and then craft centers, innumerable. In fact, one needs to do a proper bit of research on all the work that she actually did. But I'm just giving you a broad kind of a landscape here. Can we move to the next one, please? She spent a large time of her life being banned or imprisoned and detained without trial. And I remember there were times when the children were really harassed and never knew where their parents would be when. But when Winnie, who was a very good friend, went into prison, then Fatima would take over and look after Winnie's children. And I remember there was a time when we were so distraught by both Fatima and her husband being imprisoned, taken away, that my father tried very hard. And he said, what can we do for those children? And I remember him buying swings and seesaws and things just to make those children happy for a little bit. So the community was very much around and was very aware of what was happening to them. Shortly after her release, she even survived an assassination attempt when her house was petrol bombed, but that still didn't deter her. Another sad episode in her life was when her only son, Rashid, who had to go on exile, was later tragically killed in a road accident. That was devastating for her. Can we move on, please? Here's Fatima, very much a mother, despite all the other activities that were taking much of her time. And Shamim, Shanaz, and Rashid are there. And Shamim remembers her mother always wanting to sketch and paint and do things like that. And I remember Fatima actually even building a house up with Hamish Dickie Clark in the Drakensberg. So she tried her hand at everything. Move on. Here are examples of her prison paintings, which are quite amazing. They really are sort of like Van Gogh-y. But what she was trying to express again was to document everything that was happening. There's another slide, can we move on, which actually shows you what was happening to these women in the prisons and how she documents every bit of their life. Can we move on then, finally? And what I find amazing about these prison pictures is the color, that there was no bleakness about this personality. And as an activist throughout her life, she never grumbled, she never actually asked people to feel sorry for her. She was never bitter in any way. She just did what she had to do. But this great life experience comes out in the painting, which expresses this wonderful woman. Can we move on? But towards the end of her life, she became very disillusioned with the freedom struggle and what had happened, because she was really a true activist in that sense. And her work and her life were never ending. And for her, she was very disappointed in the kind of leadership that the ANC has actually projected, and she talked openly about it. Fine, thank you. And of course, I'm ending with this beautiful picture of her and Mandela. And I think this picture captures her whole life, that that Fatima Meer was a true diehard South African. My question now would be to ask ourselves, what example then can Fatima set for our times and our place in the world? What has she left for us to contemplate on? And I would like to suggest chiefly four. The number one, grassroots work was the key. She was an organizer, she was a community reference point and a champion of the dispossessed. For her, the cell began as a community. She was one of the founders of the union movement, Women Federation of South African Women. She gave voice to women on shop floors, at sites of contestation, be it threatened in the Indian market. I was alongside there with her in 1972, or in the silent pilgrimage outside of the Durban Central Jail. She was always to be found in a sari. So she never lost her definition of who she was, which was interesting. She was not apologetic about her ethnic identity, and yet she rose above her ethnicity, but was secure in who she was. And I think that for me was a very interesting aspect of her life. Secondly, I think that she was very grounded in empiricism. Allied to her activism, she was equally comfortable as an academic who produced original work which can still be referenced. Alongside her work on Gandhi and Mandela, she also produced a major study of Indian South Africans in 1970. And too many activists today actually they lack that ability to research and study some of the half-baked critiques of economic theory or Africanist dogma. But Fatima actually ensured that this rigor, she had to make sure that she put forth. The third factor is that she was unafraid to criticize former colleagues, even if it was unpalatable to do so. Polybius said, "We should not shrink from accusing our friends and praising our enemies, since it is neither possible that man should always be in the right, nor is it probable that they will always be mistaken." Fatima bravely lived this. One of her finest battles was at the wheelchair. As an octogenarian in a wheelchair, she took on the ANC-led municipality to campaign for the rights of poor Africans and Indians in Chatsworth. We Are the Poor was one of the books that came out of that experience with Ashwin Desai. Earlier, she had turned down Mandela's offer to serve in the parliament as an ANC MP because she was worried that she would have to compromise her ability to call on any ANC failings. And fourthly, she was comfortable being located in the Indian community in the full sense of the word. The Indian community in South Africa, as has earlier been said, is not a homogeneous community. It straddles at least three major religions, speaking several mother tongues, and historically coming from a multiple of different continents. Today, it is easy for the community to have splintered into multiple interest groups. Perhaps because of a unique melting pot of a family. Her family came from Gujarat, from Bora, Jewish, Portuguese, all descendants. Fatima espoused an open and inclusive vision of Indianness, and we would do well to emulate this today. Thank you. Am I done?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Devi Rajab is no longer audible. And I want to say thank you very much for that very revealing presentation. It was excellent. And I thank you so much for having been here on this platform to share it. So thank you so much, Dr. Rajab. At this point in time, good. At this point in time, I want to invite any of you who may have questions for any member of our panel this evening to kindly raise your electronic hand. It is in the reactions button at the base of your computer screen. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your electronic hand and I'd like to call upon you. So I want to say thank you to all of our presenters today. Thanks so much for your time, for your sacrifice in being here at this late hour, and for sharing what you have. I'm seeing a comment and a question from Dr. Roseanne Kanhai in the chat. So she says, generally speaking, Indians of indentured histories have complex relationships with African and/or African-descended populations. What can we learn from each other about how to respect and work and live together with African and African-descended groups, given the colonial strategies that pitted these two groups against each other while oppressing both? What can we learn from the anti-apartheid movement that is valuable in contemporary situations? She did not request a particular speaker, but I want to throw this out to Dr. Mohammed Keshavi. Would you like to respond to this question, sir? Can you unmute, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting question because in the entire diaspora, we are all living at the fault line of history. I think the British rule was the colonial rule of divide and rule. And we are now always being faced with this idea that you came as a consignment of British colonialism. Why are you still around? It's our turn now to take over. I think that one thing we can learn from this whole situation, because saw what happened in East Africa, is we cannot now live in pockets of exclusivity. We got to now be seen as important players in the whole notion of civil society. We need to be democratically engaged. If we see something wrong, I think Fatima Mir is a person from whom we can learn. Amit Katrada is another person. I'm sorry. These are people who were able to speak truth to power. They were not there for position. After all their lives of struggle, they were not going to get on the gravy train. They were going to say, if something is not correct, let us stand up and speak for it. I think the time has come in Fiji, in Trinidad, in Guyana, in East Africa, in Botswana. Excuse me.
Hey, Dr. Keshavi, I hope everything is okay.
I'm sorry about that. The time has come that we need to participate in the democratic process. If we see something wrong, we need to stand for it. And thirdly, as a minority community, in all these places, we got to be seen as being involved in the social process to bring about a better life for everyone.
Yes, agreed. Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Mahabir has a question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I want to address a point that was raised earlier. And that is, you know, there is a perception that Indians, in a lot of these diasporic societies, when Indians are successful, whether in business or the professions, that there is no problem. They're not encountering any difficulties or forms of discrimination because they're successful, and we can see graphs and charts on this. The point I want to make in almost all these diaspora countries, Indians are marginalized, they are discriminated, they are made invisible, and they succeed in spite of the oppressive system, not because of, but in spite of. The second point I want to make is that we have heard that there are Indians in the anti-apartheid struggle who, some of them were collaborators, some of them were conspirators, some of them were indifferent, some of them were freedom fighters. But these traits we can see in almost all groups and in all movements. In slavery, for instance, you had the house slaves, you had the slave catchers, and also you have the freedom fighters. So it's not peculiar to Indians in South Africa that some were conspirators and all of that. It's universal. Those are the 2 points I want to make. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Mahabir, thank you so much. I'm not seeing any raised hands. There was so much happening on the chat, but no one seems to have any questions. And oh, David Clark would like to ask a question now. David, go ahead very quickly, please.
Oh, yes. All right. Buenos días, ¿cómo estás? Thank you for your presentation on South Africa with the Indians. My question is, how did the Indians in South Africa were treated?
David, could you just contextualize that? Treated when?
Oh, how the East Indians were treated in South Africa in terms of indentureship.
Okay, thank you. Who in our panel would like to take that one? It's open to anyone.
I think Fatima Meer's book, Indians in South Africa, chronicles some of the struggles of the early indentured laborers. And I think there's a story of a girl called Valyama Mudliar, a very young girl who was killed or died under very tragic circumstances. And I think it was around the time of Mahatma Gandhi's early struggle in the Transvaal. So there are many chronicle pictures of what the indentured laborers went through. I think Mahatma Gandhi's granddaughter or great-granddaughter, I think Ella Bai, Dr. Gandhi would be able to tell us that one of your nieces, I think, wrote the book, The Cane Cutters or something. I think it does capture the early struggle of the indentured laborers. And myself, coming from a passenger Indian background, I remember when I met Nishan Bolton, we were discussing that our experiences of the South African apartheid was relatively different coming from different parts of the country. If you were in the Transvaal, you faced a different type of an apartheid than what you were in Natal. But there was also cleavage between the passenger Indians and the indentured Indians, and what type of indignities that the indentured Indians faced in the early days, which I don't think was a similar experience with the passenger Indians. If that gives just a slight background, but I'm sure somebody who's now in South Africa would be able to speak more to it than myself, having left about 50 years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Keshavji. Eva Gandhi, would you like to respond?
I think, just taking it further from what Dr. Keshavji has spoken about, I think, it's true that different people experience the differences differently. You see the more affluent, educated Indians experience the differences in terms of race differently from the poorer Indians, the less educated Indians. For instance, let me just cite some examples. When it comes to work, there's a huge competition at the lower level. I don't like the word lower level, but that's how we are, at the moment looking at it, where menial jobs, for instance, are advertised. There's a huge competition. And, that's where you find that the racial, differences arise. At the professional level, there is a different type of competition and, workplace ethics and that sort of thing that are happening at the professional level. I'm sure Kalpana and others would say what happens at university level in terms of the present day, BEE applications and all that sort of thing. So these are the stories we hear from people who experience the differences, racial differences in different ways. In the past, it was the same situation where race, gender, and class, differences were sort of conflated, and it became, people would emphasize the racial difference, and yet it was based on class and based on gender as well. So one has to be very careful about how we look at these things, how different people experience racism differently. And, so it's a very complex situation. in South Africa, and in particular, the the fact that people are living in different areas makes a very big difference. And we saw this 2 years ago in 1921, when there was unrest, particularly in the Durban area, where there was just one community living in a huge area like Phoenix, like Chatsworth, and some areas in Pietermaritzburg. The whole situation began to take a racial, sort of a racist, scene. Whereas in Durban, the same thing happened. People had groups of people who were taking care of their areas, looking after their families. So people came together to watch their neighborhood watches. But when it came, and in the Durban Central area, we saw this, a place where I live, for instance, the groups who took care of our neighborhood were mixed groups. So you had Africans, Indians, white, colored, everyone together, because everyone was concerned about the unrest in Durban. But when you go to Phoenix, because largely the Phoenix area is Indian, you find that the neighborhood watch was only Indian. And then it began to be called, a sort of hit squad, or I don't know the names that they gave to that particular area. And it must be, said, because people are talking about the racial, killings that happened in Phoenix. But, when you look at the reality, there was a small number. Now, some people say 36 who died in Phoenix, but 300 and some odd died throughout the affected areas. So how can one say that everything happened in Phoenix and, point out Phoenix as a area where there was this racial killing, and then say that all Indians are racist because of that? So generalization like that happens, and it happens, it's orchestrated by people for particular reasons, and you find that it spreads because of media coverage, because of social media that pinpoints certain things and ignores other things. So these are some of the circumstances that we find ourselves in South Africa at the moment.
Thank you for that very
explained. Yeah.
A very detailed comment on that. Thank you so much. Jay, you had your hand up. Did you want to add anything?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that, as far as racism is concerned, it's systemic. It's all over. I'm sitting here in North America. I can see what the Black Lives Matter has done. And it sort of caused the African peoples around the world to get another feather in the cap to ask for a lot of things. But when it comes to South Africa, I'm sitting here 45, 46 years away. I can't give you the picture after 94, because what we fought for till 94 is not materialized, because people who went into the system were not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They were looking after themselves. And I, for one, wasn't called up to come back to South Africa as a part of the ANC movement, because I was in the anti-apartheid movement here through the labor movement. So they had their cabal going from the rest of the world to South Africa, who had no knowledge of how to govern. So there was a mishmash for the first 5 years, or first 10 years. Now it's 20 years, then it's gone to 30 years, and there's still the mishmash in governing. So having said that, racism is found in every part of the world where the Indians are, where Africans are, where whites are, and where the mixed race. Now, we are accustomed to calling ourselves Indians, Africans, coloreds, and whites because of the apartheid system. But if you go to North America, they don't talk about what you call Indians, Africans, whites, and coloreds. They talk of black and white. It's two races. And that Black Lives Matter propelled the need for what blacks need. So it's a difficult situation in South Africa. And I for one, went through the battle, went through the family struggles and so on. The leadership is not what we want, or what we would like to see. And I don't know what's going to happen next year. I just don't have a crystal ball. So having said that, it's a difficult, very difficult. And as Sister Ella said, this is something that I don't know how it's going to remedy itself. Not in my lifetime, maybe the younger generation will do that. And that's my piece that I want to say from here.
Jay, but let me ask you a question. Would you, if given the opportunity, would you want to return to South Africa to live?
Not in the current situation. I wouldn't. Because when I go there, the first thing I will start picking and calling out all the shots. Number one, they took employment equity from Canada. Secondly, they took all the governance from Canada. They got money from Canada to do the governing and do the HIV/AIDS. We sent money. Where is all that money gone to? People are still starving, still dying, and they are not educated. Why is it so? And the very fact that I sat around a table sitting with the delegation that came to talk about employment equity, and they're applying B. We never heard of B. Employment equity was to include everybody irrespective of, and as long as you can fulfill certain obligation for the job that you go in. So from a labor standpoint and from a labor rep, this is what I gave to South Africa. But to go back there, first thing I will start picking on it and picking on all the problems. And I wouldn't last 24, 48 hours. I'll be gone. And who knows where. So Shalima, to answer your question, I wouldn't go back even given the opportunity.
I understand, and I want to thank you so much for your honesty. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring today's session to a close. I really, really, really appreciate all of our speakers, and thank you so very much for coming here and giving your truths individually and sharing your personal knowledge about some very special people in the Indian diaspora who helped in South Africa in whatever way, both positively and negatively. They've made contributions, and we all have to reflect on sometimes in context. Sometimes when what we consider to be negative might be very positive depending on who you are at that moment in time. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'll now turn you over to the chair, Shakira.
Thank you, Shalima, and thank you all for taking the time to attend and to participate. And thank you especially to the presenters for their time, their knowledge, their expertise, and their sacrifice. As we've said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and you can feel free to contact the ICC to publish your books and your reports. Remember that we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details. Thank you to our advisory and planning team, led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir, and to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravin Ramsing, who has been recording the program and will upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. Our topic next Sunday will be the Indo-Caribbean display at the Museum of London. So please feel free to visit our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.
Just before I want to go, can I have a word